set up by his own brother for stealing $60,000. The young man was kicked out of the house by his father, penniless. What will happen when the truth is revealed? Join us as we follow this family story full of twists, betrayal, and a stunning turn of events. Carl was once the kind of father everyone believed would never abandon his child. He wasn't wealthy, but he was respected in the area for his unmatched woodworking skills. The house he built with his own hands, and the workshop in the backyard, filled with the scent of pine wood and the sound of saws, was the legacy he left for his only son, Nate. Nate grew up next to the planer, chisel, and the wood shavings that clung to his shirt. While his friends went off to college, he stayed behind, quietly learning the trade and taking care of his aging father. No one forced him to stay. He chose it. Because for Nate, it was his way of holding on to the memory of his late mother, the one who used to sit on the porch, watching the two of them build wooden chairs when he was only 8 years old. Their life was simple. Dinner consisted of homemade hamburgers, root beer, and going over Carl's old designs. It might not have been luxurious, but it was peaceful. Until Kathy came into the picture. Carl met her at a local carpenter's meeting. A soft-spoken woman, always smiling and calling Carl the last true craftsman. She made him laugh again, made him feel admired. Just a few months later, they got married. Nate didn't object, but he wasn't exactly happy either. He stayed silent because if it made his father happy, he accepted it. Kathy didn't come alone. She brought her son, Mason, a 23-year-old guy who studied marketing but dropped out because it wasn't the right environment. With his slicked-back hair, clothes always smelling of fabric softener, and a voice so smooth as if he had never done a day of manual labor, Mason walked into the house like he had always belonged there. "This is my eldest son, Mason," Kathy introduced him, as if Nate were just a guest. From the very beginning, Mason knew how to charm everyone. He frequently complimented Carl's woodworking, asked about recipes, and brought up old stories Carl loved to tell. Meanwhile, Nate quietly worked, kept the workshop running, inspected every piece of wood, and fixed any uneven table legs. He didn't like talking much, and perhaps that's why he started to fade into the background in his own home. Mason didn't help in the workshop, but he always showed up whenever there were visitors. He'd smile, shake hands, and even accept compliments on behalf of Nate. "We're just working together," Mason would say, even though he didn't know how to handle a saw. Carl would just laugh, not realizing his own son was standing behind him, wiping sweat off his brow. Then the little things started happening. An order got delivered wrong, and Carl got upset. Mason claimed he had provided the correct information, and Nate was the one who did the final check. Nate insisted he had never seen that invoice, but Carl just frowned. "You need to focus more." One morning, Nate discovered a newly finished chair with a broken leg. It was a regular customer's order. A mistake that couldn't be forgiven. Mason said it might have been chewed on by rats, then laughed as if it were a joke. Nate stayed silent. When Carl asked, Mason looked straight at Nate and said, "Maybe it was because of the nail he used yesterday. It looked a bit thin." No one verified it. No one questioned it. Carl just looked at Nate, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Stop being careless." One day, the saw got jammed. The only person who had used it recently was Mason, even though he didn't know how to operate it. Carl shook his head. Must be Nate didn't clean it properly. The comment was light, but to Nate, it felt like a thin knife slicing through his heart. The little things kept adding up. Every time Mason made a mistake, somehow Nate ended up being the one held responsible. And each time, Carl trusted Mason more, while losing a little more patience with his own son. One late evening, Nate heard soft voices in the workshop, where he and his father kept the precious wood. He walked over and found Mason rummaging through the filing cabinet. Mason jumped, forced a smile. "I'm looking for warranty papers for Dad. It's fine, no need to help." Then he walked out like nothing happened. Nate went in to check, found nothing missing, but the feeling of unease started creeping in. It wasn't about the documents, but the way Mason looked at him, as if he were the one standing in the way. Kathy was always gentle. She would often remind Carl that Nate should be more open, less selfish, and learn to share. Every time she said that, Carl would nod. Nate stayed silent, because here his voice had begun to feel redundant. Since Mason arrived, everything changed. The house was no longer a place of peace, but a place where Nate had to tread carefully, as if walking on shards of glass. And he knew, sooner or later, something bigger would happen. He just didn't expect it would take away the home he once thought would last forever. That morning, it drizzled lightly. The tin roof of the workshop creaked rhythmically, like a forewarning. Nate sat, double-checking the orders for the upcoming week, his eyes scanning through the numbers and price lists. But the air in the house felt more suffocating than usual. Carl was quieter. Kathy silently poured coffee, no longer asking how things were, as she used to. And Mason, he still smiled, still polite, but his eyes could no longer hide the contempt every time they turned toward Nate. The day before, the automatic milling machine, the most expensive equipment in the workshop, suddenly stopped working mid-operation. Carl was furious when he discovered the system had been set to the wrong mode. Nate insisted he hadn't touched it all week. But Mason claimed he saw Nate plug a USB into the machine the day before, as if he were backing up some data. Carl just looked at his son without asking further. He didn't raise his voice, but that look was heavier than any words. Since Mason had arrived, incidents like this kept happening. A missed deadline because an order lost its blueprint. A set of chairs drilled off-center. A customer complaining about the wrong paint color. Every time something went wrong, Mason would coincidentally find something related to Nate. And Carl, instead of investigating, started to believe that his son was losing focus, or worse, sabotaging the workshop his father had built. A week after the milling machine incident, Carl received a call from the equipment supplier. They asked about the advance payment for the new batch of machines worth $60,000. Money Carl had set aside in the office safe, but hadn't transferred yet as he was waiting for the shipping confirmation. He immediately rushed to check. The safe was open. The money was gone. The whole house fell silent. Carl stood motionless, his hands trembling as he flipped through the papers in the safe, as if hoping there might be a few bills left somewhere. Kathy was the first to speak. Mason remained silent, looking at Nate. "Does anyone else know the safe's code besides Dad?" Kathy asked, her voice sounding fake with concern. Carl looked up, and before he could answer, Mason spoke. "Last week, Nate asked me how to change the safe's code. At the time, I thought he was asking to change his personal code, but now—" Nate turned to him, eyes wide in disbelief. "I never—" "Dad, I'm not saying Nate did it," Mason quickly interjected, his face showing clear signs of insincerity. "I just noticed he's been near the office a few times lately. It could be just a coincidence." Carl looked at his son. "Is this true?" Nate opened his mouth, but in the room filled with suspicious stares, every explanation felt pointless. That afternoon, Mason accidentally found a paper bag stuffed deep in Nate's desk drawer. Inside was a few $1,000s in fresh bills. Not much, but enough to make an impact. "I found it while looking for documents for last week's order," Mason said, holding the bag out in front of Carl. "I didn't say anything earlier because what if it was just a misunderstanding?" Carl opened the bag and sniffed the fresh scent of the new bills. He stood there, speechless. Nate clenched his fists. "It's not mine. I don't know who put it there." "Then who else could have accessed your desk besides you?" Kathy interjected, her voice still soft, but each word felt like a needle. "Mason has no reason to harm his brother." Carl didn't say anything, but his silence was answer enough. Nate walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He didn't yell or break anything. He just breathed heavily. His mind was spinning. Everything was too perfect, too much like a trap set long ago. But he had no proof. And he knew. No one here wanted to hear the truth from his side anymore. That evening, Carl called him into the study. The yellow light made every wrinkle on his face more apparent. "Tell me," he began, his voice low, almost trembling. "If you're going through something, just say it. I won't blame you. But if you took that money and didn't say anything, then you're not the person I thought you were." Nate scoffed bitterly. Not because it was funny, but because the father who had taught him how to cut wood at the right 45-degree angle, the one who held him when his mother died, now thought he was a thief. "Do you trust your wife's son more than your own flesh and blood?" Nate asked, his eyes locked on his father's. "Don't change the subject," Carl snapped. I just want to know the truth. I didn't take the money. Then explain. Where is it? Why was it in your desk? Nate remained silent, because any words right now would only make him seem like a liar. The next morning, he was asked to pack up and leave the house. Kathy stood on the doorstep, not saying a word. Mason walked him to the gate, patting him lightly on the shoulder. I hope you find the answer soon, he said. Then, leaning in, he whispered just loud enough for Nate to hear. You should know when to back off. The gate closed. The sky was still gray. Nate walked away without looking back. He had nowhere to go, no way to prove his innocence. But inside him, a silent vow began to form. This time, he would not disappear in silence. Not with his name smeared. Not with his career buried by someone living a lie. And definitely not with empty hands. That night, Nate slept on a bench in a park nearly 2 miles from home. The cold wind seeped through his thin coat, his body curled up, his hands gripping his backpack as if it held the last valuable thing in his life. He didn't cry. He wasn't angry. He just felt empty. It was as if he had been severed from the roots he had clung to his entire life. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he got up and slowly walked to the nearby gas station to wash his face. The wary look from the cashier felt like needles pricking his skin. As he stepped outside, an old man pouring motor oil turned and asked, "Are you lost?" Nate didn't answer, just lowered his head. Maybe in their eyes he was just another aimless, homeless wanderer. 2 days later, he went to the industrial area at the edge of town to look for work. The smell of grease, the sound of machines, and the clatter of metal hitting metal bombarded his senses. A truck repair shop was hiring for loading and unloading cargo and cleaning equipment. Nate walked in and extended his hand to greet them. The owner, a stocky black man named Marvin, looked him up and down. "What did you do before?" Marvin asked, never removing the cigarette from his mouth. "Carpenter, but I'll take any job at this point." Marvin shrugged. "As long as you're not lazy, don't show up late, and don't ask too many questions." Nate started the job the very next day. His hands were familiar with the work, but the environment here was completely different. Instead of the smell of wood, it was the scent of grease, gasoline, and sweat. His coworkers didn't talk much. They lived in a no-nonsense way. Show up, work, leave. Nate did the same. He rented a small room in an old boarding house near the shop. The room was about the size of half his old kitchen, with peeling walls and a shared bathroom. But at least it had a lock. At least it was his own. Every night, he would lie there, listening to the arguments from the neighboring room, the sound of car horns outside, and then he'd remember the familiar noises of the saw, his father's voice calling from the workshop. "Nate, get me the measuring tape." Now those were just memories. The pay from the shop wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a few boxes of instant noodles, some fruit, and cheap soap. He cut out everything unnecessary. No internet, no TV, just a notebook where he wrote down every expense, a habit he had learned from Carl back in the day. During the day, he worked. At night, he went online at the public library, reading DIY mechanical projects, not to switch careers, but to keep his mind from rusting. He didn't want to just be a machine doing labor. He needed to think. He needed to know what else he was capable of. Once, a coworker messed up the oil pump system. Nate didn't blame him. He just quietly searched for tools, took it apart, and fixed it in 15 minutes. Marvin stood behind him, watching silently. That evening, he handed Nate a can of beer and said, "Didn't know you knew this stuff. Tomorrow, help me replace the machine shaft." That was the first time anyone had believed in him since he was kicked out of the house. Those signals were what kept Nate from breaking. Marvin didn't ask about the past, but he paid attention. Sometimes he gave Nate an extra portion of lunch or told him to go home early when it was cold and rainy. 3 months passed. Nate was no longer as skinny as before. His arms were more muscular, and the dark circles under his eyes had faded. He started sleeping more soundly, eating regularly, and thinking more clearly. But the questions still weighed heavily on his mind. Why did Mason do that? Was it out of jealousy, for money, or just because he wanted to remove him from that life? One day, while cleaning out the old oil storage, Nate found an abandoned shelf with a broken leg and rotting wood. He asked Marvin if he could take it home, and then quietly brought it behind the boarding house, fixing it little by little. He sawed the leg, replaced the shelf panel, and polished the surface. He didn't know what he was going to do with it. He just needed to keep his hands busy. It was like a part of him still needed to reconnect with the wood, with what had once been his true self. That evening, when he finished, he sat down and gently touched the freshly polished surface. For the first time in months, his eyes began to water. Not because of sadness, but because of something very strange. It felt like he had just found a small piece of himself again. But that very night, while browsing the internet at the library, an image suddenly appeared. A post on a classified site. A set of intricately designed wooden furniture, the very design from his father's shop, but without the logo. The seller's name, mtools23. Nate stared at the screen. The table leg had a distinct cut, one he had made himself while adjusting the cutting tool. It was unmistakable. It was his work. But now it was being sold as collectible, and the seller's account was anonymous. He knew he had just stumbled upon something. A crack in Mason's too-perfect mask. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Nate couldn't sleep that night. He sat in the library until they turned off the lights and signaled for closing time. The image of the wooden table with the distinctive cut kept repeating in his mind. That design wasn't common. In fact, it hadn't even been uploaded to the workshop's website. He was the one who created it, adjusted it, and knew every grain of the wood like the back of his hand. There was only one possibility. Someone from the house had taken it outside, and that person was selling it as their own. Nate wrote down the seller's account name, mtools23. The email address was hidden. The shipping information used a third-party delivery service. Everything was carefully arranged, but too perfectly so, making it suspicious. He didn't contact them. He didn't send any messages. Instead, he began to watch. Every night, he returned to the page, taking screenshots of each product posted for sale. Most were tables, bookshelves, chairs, all items from the design samples of the old workshop. Some even still had the engraved customer names that Nate had done personally. A few weeks later, Nate noticed the account operated on a cycle, a post every 3 days around 10 p.m. Never a day missed, never a minute late. It was like a professional job, not just someone selling off extra items. He started comparing the items and the posting times. One table appeared on Tuesday. He remembered that design. It was made about 3 months ago, back when he was still at home. The problem was, that product had been canceled because the customer postponed the order. No one should have it. But now, here it was, intact. Mason didn't make that table, but he was selling it. And if Nate's suspicions were correct, these weren't leftovers. They were stolen property. Nate knew he needed more evidence. One weekend evening, he took an early leave from the repair shop, hopped on a bus, and went near the old neighborhood. He didn't go home, just stood at a distance and observed. The workshop door was dark, but there was a light on in the small storage area to the left, where temporary stock used to be stored. Around 10:15 p.m., a gray SUV stopped in front of the side door. A figure stepped out, unlocked the storage with a key card, and carried something covered with a cloth. It was unclear what it was, but its size and shape resembled a chair. Nate pulled out his phone and took a picture of the license plate. In the dim light, the person's face was hard to make out, but the walk was eerily familiar. Straight back, shoulders slightly raised, it was Mason's walk. He didn't dare get any closer. He just stood there, hidden behind the row of trees, waiting for the car to leave. Then he turned and left silently, without a sound. The next morning, Nate took the license plate number to ask a former friend, Evan, for help. Evan had studied security engineering with him back in high school. Now he worked as a technician for a cybersecurity software company. They weren't close, but they trusted each other enough for a favor. Evan agreed to look into it without asking too many questions. A week later, he called back. The license plate is registered under a small trading company, MK Services, with the legal representative being Kathy Lee. Nate wasn't surprised. He just let out a slow breath. Kathy started that company 6 months ago. It's registered at a virtual office in a neighboring state, receiving goods and forwarding them through a third-party warehouse. And the selling account? Nate asked. Evan paused for a moment. It's also registered under that company, but there's an IP address that logged in from the family network. The address is your old house number." There was no more doubt. Nate didn't call Carl, he didn't text, he didn't write a letter. He knew he couldn't just bring the truth to the table and expect it to be accepted immediately. He needed something irrefutable. So he made a plan. Nothing big, nothing complicated, but enough to pull Mason's mask off in the light. In the meantime, he continued working at the repair shop. His hands grew rougher with each passing day, but his eyes were sharper than before. He was no longer the man who had been kicked out of his home. He was the man waiting for the right moment to turn everything around. There were nights when he stood in front of the old wooden board he had once repaired, asking himself, if he failed this time, would he have anything left to lose? Then he thought of Carl's eyes, the way they had once looked at him like he was a stranger. And he knew silence was no longer an option. One evening, as he scrolled through the newly listed items, he saw a new piece, an antique-style cabinet engraved with a customer's name. That one had been canceled, but he remembered Carl saying he'd keep it because he liked the design. Now it was here, being sold as exclusive. Mason wasn't just stealing property, he was selling the honor of the entire workshop, of his father, of their family, and perhaps Carl had no idea. Nate looked at his watch. Almost 10 p.m. It was time. He didn't call the police right away. He didn't notify anyone. He didn't confront anyone. He knew if he did, they'd deny everything. Mason was skilled at manipulation. Kathy left no trace behind. He needed something no one could argue with. An image. A sound. The right moment. Irrefutable evidence. He returned to the repair shop as usual, working the night shift, staying silent. But outside, he began to prepare. He went to a security equipment store, bought an infrared camera disguised inside a water pipe, along with the cheapest wireless recording system he could find, but one that was clear enough. Money was tight, but he didn't care. Because if he failed this time, everything he had endured so far would be for nothing. On Friday night, Marvin, the repair shop owner, unexpectedly gave everyone an early leave because the lift was broken. Nate seized the opportunity, heading back to the old neighborhood. He wasn't planning to break in. He just stood at a distance, observing as he had before, then made his way along the back path leading to the storage yard, where there was a dilapidated wooden fence. He squeezed through the familiar gap, slipping into the back of the auxiliary storage, the place where he used to keep unfinished wooden pieces for sale. There were no cameras there. He knew because he had once installed the surveillance system in the shop himself. Mason might have removed a few parts later on, but the auxiliary storage was definitely still untouched because it was just a place to dump temporary items. Nate set up the small camera on the ceiling, aiming it directly at the storage door and the yard outside. The signal receiver was hidden in an old toolbox beneath a discarded wooden crate. He double-checked the signal on his phone. The image was clear enough to identify a person, even in the dark. 3 days later, on Monday at 10 p.m. Right on time. The camera recorded a gray SUV pulling up, 2 people getting out. Mason opened the storage door. Kathy stood holding it open. In their hands was a small table, its glossy wood surface with the familiar hand-carved pattern. They were talking quietly, smiling, without a care in the world, because they thought no one was watching them anymore. Nate saved the video, copied it to an external hard drive. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he went straight to the local police station. No need for lengthy explanations. He just plugged the hard drive into the computer of the officer on duty. "I want to report organized theft." The officer was initially skeptical, but after watching the video and looking at the photos Nate had collected earlier, his attitude changed. They invited him inside, asking for more details. Who was the owner of the shop? Who had ownership of the property? Who was in control now? He explained clearly. The property belonged to the family business, owned by Carl Morrison. Mason and Kathy weren't listed in the founding documents. As for Nate, though he had been kicked out, his signature was still on the previous labor agreement, proving he was the lead carpenter with the authority to oversee and identify products. The police asked for more evidence. Nate handed over all the photos, the shipping information, and data from the classified site. Most importantly, the proof that Mason had used the home network to post the products for sale. 3 days later, a search warrant was approved. The police called Nate and asked if he wanted to participate. He agreed. Not to see them get arrested, but to witness justice take its course. That evening, around 9:30, he and the police were hiding near the storage. The lights were off. No one said a word. At almost 10, the familiar SUV pulled up again. Mason got out of the car, opened the storage door. Kathy followed, carrying a large bag. Before they could open the door, the headlights flashed on. The police had surrounded them from both sides. Mason froze. Kathy stepped back, mumbling something that couldn't be understood. Mason Morrison, Kathy Lee, you are under arrest for suspected theft of property, illegal sales, and abuse of company assets. The officer's voice rang out, firm and clear. Mason looked around, trying to maintain his calm. There must be some misunderstanding. Then you can explain at the station, the officer replied, cuffing him. Kathy seemed to want to say something, but the female officer quietly led her away, not giving her any time to argue. Nate stood off to the side, silent. But his eyes never left Carl, who had just stepped out of the house, his face frozen in shock as he saw the two being escorted to the police car. He didn't say anything. He didn't cry. He didn't look at Nate either. Perhaps it wasn't until that moment that Carl truly understood the whole story, how he had trusted the wrong person, neglected his own son, and allowed the workshop that had once been his lifelong pride to turn into a black market operation. The police car door slammed shut. The sound of it echoed like the final punctuation to months of silent manipulation. But for Nate, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, because even though justice had intervened, the wound left by a family member was still there. And he knew the hardest part was still to come. Carl didn't come to find Nate after Mason and Kathy were arrested. Perhaps he didn't know what to say. Maybe he needed time to accept that it was his own hands that had pushed his son out of the house while letting the thief sit in the seat of inheritance. Whatever the reason, Nate didn't care anymore. He wasn't waiting for anything from his father. He was busy living. The repair shop still opened every day. Nate still worked the morning shift, ate cold sandwiches for lunch, and cooked simple meals in his room at night. But there was one thing that had changed. His eyes no longer looked down. He had faced the truth, confronted the pain, and he had won. A week after the arrest, Marvin called him into the office. "Someone's waiting for you outside in the yard," he said, not needing to mention the name. Nate knew who it was. Carl was standing next to the old truck, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, as if unsure what to do with them. He looked older. His shoulders weren't as straight as they used to be. His eyes were dark and red, as if he hadn't slept for many nights. When Nate stepped out, Carl looked up, his gaze meeting his son's for a brief moment, then quickly dropped. No words were spoken, no hugs, just the wind blowing through and the sounds of machinery echoing from the workshop. "I don't know where to start," Carl said, his voice hoarse. Everything I thought, I was wrong." Nate remained silent. "I abandoned you. I didn't listen to you. I believed the lies just because they fit what I wanted to hear. I wanted to believe that Mason was helping me keep the shop. I wanted to believe that there would be someone to carry on if you weren't there." Still silence. Carl sighed, as if each word he spoke aged him a year. "Mason confessed everything," he continued. "He said it had been planned for a long time. He used my trust, set you up, took the money, took the products. Even his mother was involved. They used me as a tool to cover up everything." "You're not a tool," Nate replied calmly. "You're the one who decided to kick me out." Carl nodded. "I know. I can't fix that. But if you need anything—" "I don't need anything," Nate cut him off. "I have a job. I have a place to stay. I'm living without needing you to carry anything for me anymore." Carl lowered his head. "Just give me a chance to start over, to do whatever I can to make it right." Nate looked at him for a long time. No anger, no emotion, just quiet. "You can't make up for it," he said. "No one can. But you can start by being real. Don't avoid it. Don't pretend everything's fine." Carl nodded, this time slowly. "I understand." He didn't ask Nate to come back home. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stood there, like a man learning how to live again after realizing he had destroyed the most valuable thing he ever had. Nate returned to the workshop, continuing to work as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had quietly shifted. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just lighter. 2 months later, Mason and Kathy's case went to a preliminary trial. Mason faced multiple charges, from theft, fraud, to financial misconduct. Kathy was charged as an accomplice and for aiding in the illegal disposal of stolen property. They had no way to deny it. The evidence from the camera, the sales listings, and the conflicting testimonies between the two. Carl was called to testify as a witness. He sat in the courtroom, his face emotionless, his voice monotone as he confirmed the entire truth. When the lawyer asked how he felt upon discovering that his stepson and wife had betrayed him, Carl simply replied, "I feel like a failed father." Nate didn't go to the trial. He didn't want to see them anymore. No need for confirmation. No need to witness them bow their heads. For him, justice wasn't about how many years they would get behind bars. It was about the lies finally being exposed. As for him, he was still living, still working. But he had moved out of his old room. The savings from more than 6 months of work, plus an unexpected bonus from Marvin, who had quietly followed the entire story, were enough for him to rent a small workshop on the outskirts of town. It wasn't big, but it was enough to set up the old planer, buy a few basic tools, and most importantly, rebuild himself. He named the workshop True Grain Woodworks. Real wood, real grain, and real people. His first customer was a single mother who needed a bookshelf made for her second-grade son. The second was a retired couple who wanted their old wedding table restored. Gradually, his name started to spread. Quietly, no advertisements, just word of mouth from one person to another. He makes things by hand, every plane stroke is from the heart. Carl came by once, bringing an old chisel that had belonged to his father. He placed it on the table, said nothing, and then left. Nate kept it, but didn't reach out. There was still distance between them. But this time it was a distance without bitterness, only a crack that was in the process of healing. One late afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the small window at the back of the shop, Nate sat polishing the surface of a table, the soft hum of the radio in the background. In his heart there was no more conflict, no more waiting for an apology, no more need for anyone's recognition. He only thought, sometimes being pushed to the bottom isn't the end. It's to show you that you can rise up with your own bare hands, without anyone pulling you up. And if the ones who once pushed you down come back, bow their heads, that's their story. As for you, just keep moving forward. Not everyone who leaves your life is a loss. Sometimes it's a release. And sometimes being pushed out of what seemed like home is the first step to building a better world for yourself, with your own hands, according to your own values. The pain that comes from family is often the hardest to overcome. No one expects the person who hurts you the most to be the one who once taught you to walk, the one who called you son. But when trust is exploited, loyalty is betrayed. The only thing left is yourself. And if you are patient enough, strong enough, you will see. You don't need to seek revenge. You don't need to scream for anyone to understand. Silence, growth, and success are the most resounding answers. What about you? Have you ever been hurt by someone in your own family, to the point where you had to leave to save yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to support us by hitting the subscribe button to hear more real-life stories where the truth is always revealed at the right time, and justice sometimes arrives late but never forgets its way. Thank you for listening to the whole story. See you again soon.